Are you fighting battles you never started, facing resistance you can't explain, and carrying pressure that doesn't match your effort? What if the problem isn't your discipline, your mindset, or your strategy, but an unseen system working against you? Many people are exhausted not because they are weak, but because they are fighting the wrong battle. If you've ever wondered why progress collapses at the edge of breakthrough, this message will open your eyes. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear may explain patterns in your life you could never put into words, and show you how to confront. Are you under attack? This is not a question meant to create fear, but one meant to awaken discernment. Many believers go through seasons of intense struggle without realizing that what they are facing is not merely natural opposition, human resistance, or coincidence. There are battles that cannot be explained by effort alone, intelligence alone, or strategy alone, because their roots are spiritual. When unseen forces are engaged against a person, the effects show up in very visible ways, and until the spiritual dimension is addressed, the natural symptoms continue to repeat themselves. In the realm of the spirit, altars are not just ancient religious structures. They are platforms of spiritual authorization. An altar represents a voice. It speaks, it negotiates, it demands, it enforces covenants. Every altar is powered by sacrifice, agreement, and spiritual legality. When an altar is raised against a person, family, or destiny, it does not need constant physical interaction to operate. Once it has permission, it continues to speak day and night. This is why some people fight battles they did not start, carry burdens they do not understand, and experience resistance they cannot explain. The first sign that a demonic altar may be fighting against you is persistent cycles that refuse to break. You pray, you fast, you plan, you work hard, and for a moment it looks like progress is coming. But suddenly everything collapses back to the same point. It is not that you are lazy, careless, or unwise. It is that something is enforcing a pattern. Spiritual altars thrive on repetition. They specialize in circles, not straight lines. When you notice that your life keeps returning to the same struggles despite genuine effort and spiritual hunger, their wisdom demands that you look beyond the surface and ask, what is speaking against your advancement? The second sign is unusual resistance at the edge of breakthrough. You can move easily for a long time, but the moment you approach something significant, clarity, elevation, restoration, impact, pressure intensifies, confusion increases, attacks multiply, suddenly relationships strain, finances shake, emotions fluctuate, and distractions appear from nowhere. This is not random. Altars respond when they sense a shift in spiritual ranking. When progress threatens their influence, they react. Many people mistake this resistance as a sign to retreat, when in truth it is often proof that they are close to a turning point. The third sign is consistent spiritual heaviness and oppression without clear natural cause. There are seasons when a person feels drained, discouraged, or burdened, even though nothing obvious has gone wrong. Prayer feels harder than usual. Worship feels dry. Focus becomes difficult. This is not always a lack of discipline. Sometimes it is the effect of spiritual contention. Demonic altars are sustained by spiritual atmospheres. When they are active, they release weight, weariness, and distraction to weaken a person's spiritual alertness. Their aim is not always immediate destruction. Often it is gradual exhaustion, because a tired believer is easier to resist than a fiery one. Come. The fourth sign is repeated negative spiritual encounters through dreams and impressions. Come. The spirit realm often speaks through symbols. When someone is under sustained spiritual attack, dreams may become consistently troubling. Chases, fall delays, losses, familiar hostile faces, or unfinished journeys may appear again and again. These are not to be ignored or feared, but discerned. Altars communicate through the subconscious because it is a gate of spiritual interaction. When such patterns continue without interpretation and prayerful response, the altar gains confidence to keep speaking. It is important to understand that demonic altars do not operate on strength alone. They operate on permission. They feed on ignorance, silence, and spiritual neglect. Light is their greatest enemy. The moment revelation comes, authority begins to rise. Many believers suffer not because they lack faith, but because they lack understanding of how spiritual systems function. When you know what you are dealing with, you can confront it lawfully and effectively. The good news is that no altar is eternal. Every altar can be silenced when a higher authority speaks. The spiritual realm is governed by hierarchy. When truth, righteousness, and divine alignment are established, false altars lose their voice. This is why consistent prayer is not about noise. It is about legal spiritual engagement. When a person stands in alignment with God's will, their prayers are not wishes, they are declarations backed by authority. Freedom does not come from panic, but from precision. It comes from knowing who you are, understanding what is happening, and responding with spiritual intelligence. When you build your life on light, truth, and obedience, you become difficult to manipulate spiritually. The goal is not to be obsessed with darkness, but to be so established in light that darkness has nowhere to stand. If you are under attack, it does not mean you are weak. Often it means you are significant. Resistance is drawn to value. The solution is not fear, withdrawal, or silence. The solution is clarity, alignment, and persistence. When the right voice speaks consistently, every opposing voice must eventually be quiet. Spiritual altars represent systems of authority, covenants, and transactions that speak in the spirit realm, either for or against a person. To understand this, one must first realize that the spiritual realm operates on laws, permissions, and spiritual protocols, not randomness. An altar is not merely a physical structure, it is a spiritual platform that authorizes influence. Wherever an altar exists, something is empowered to speak, to demand, and to enforce outcomes. This is why altars are closely connected to covenants, because covenants create legal access. When a covenant is active, it gives an altar the right to operate, and once that right is established, the altar continues to function, whether the person involved is aware of it or not. In spiritual terms, an altar is a meeting point between the spiritual and the natural. It is where spiritual transactions occur, where words are translated into outcomes, and where sacrifices give strength to a voice. Every altar feeds on something. It may be obedience, disobedience, ignorance, fear, faith, or sacrifice. Whatever feeds an altar determines its strength and longevity. This is why some spiritual influences appear persistent and stubborn. They are being consistently powered. When an altar is aligned with light and truth, it releases life, favor, direction, and protection. When an altar is aligned with darkness, it releases resistance, confusion, limitation, and affliction. Altars function as authorization centers. They do not randomly attack. They enforce what they have been empowered to enforce. If an altar is raised against a person, it means there is a spiritual argument being presented concerning that person's destiny, identity, or future. This argument may be rooted in ancestral covenants, spoken words, repeated disobedience, ungodly alignments, or unresolved spiritual doors. The altar does not need emotional hatred to function. It simply operates on legality. This is why emotional sincerity alone cannot shut down spiritual opposition. The spirit realm responds to authority and truth, not feelings. Another important dimension of altars is that they speak continuously. Silence in the natural does not mean inactivity in the spirit. An altar speaks day and night, reinforcing its agenda through patterns, delays, diversions, and resistance. This explains why some people experience battles that seem independent of their current choices. The altar is not responding to the present moment alone. It is enforcing an agreement established at some point in time. Until that agreement is addressed, the altar continues to speak as though it has the right to do so. Altars are also territorial. They can be attached to families, bloodlines, regions, professions, or seasons. When someone enters a territory or lineage where an altar is active, they may begin to experience pressures they never faced before. This is not imagination, it is spiritual jurisdiction. Every territory has a spiritual history, and altars preserve that history by enforcing it. This is why transformation often feels resisted when someone tries to rise above the limitations of their background. The resistance is not always from people. It is from systems that are designed to keep outcomes predictable. Spiritual altars also respond to ranking. When a person begins to grow spiritually, gain clarity, or step into purpose, their hostile altars perceive it as a threat. Their response is often intensified opposition. Not because the person has done something wrong, but because progress challenges the altar's influence. That this reveals that altars are not only defensive, but strategic. They monitor movement, growth and alignment, and they react when influence is about to shift. Understanding spiritual altars changes the way one approaches prayer and spiritual life. Prayer becomes less about begging and more about engagement. It becomes an act of enforcing higher authority rather than hoping circumstances change. When a person understands that altars speak, they also understand the necessity of building a superior altar through truth, obedience and alignment with God. A higher altar always silences a lower one, not through noise, but through authority. And authority in the spirit realm is always rooted in light, legitimacy, and spiritual order. Not every battle in life is physical or psychological. Many are spiritual conflicts rooted in unseen spiritual structures. Human beings live simultaneously in two realms, the visible and the invisible. And while the physical world is governed by natural laws, the invisible realm is governed by spiritual laws that are just as real and far more influential. When events occur repeatedly without logical explanation, when effort does not match results, and when patterns persist despite intelligence and discipline, it is often because the true source of the conflict is not located in the natural realm. Treating a spiritual problem with only natural solutions can bring temporary relief, but rarely produces lasting change. Spiritual conflicts operate beneath the surface of visible circumstances. What appears as stress, delay, confusion, or repeated loss may actually be the manifestation of an invisible struggle over authority, access, and influence. The spirit realm does not need to announce its activity for it to be effective. In fact, its greatest advantage is invisibility. Come. When people assume that everything they face must have a psychological or physical explanation, they unintentionally ignore the deeper forces shaping outcomes. This is not to deny the reality of emotions, trauma, or external pressures, but to recognize that these can be entry points rather than root causes. Unseen spiritual structures include systems of influence that have been established over time. These structures may be formed through beliefs, words, repeated actions, inherited patterns, or collective agreements. Once established, they begin to shape behavior, perception, and circumstances without constant direct intervention. This is why some people feel compelled towards certain outcomes, even when they consciously desire change. The structure is already in place, quietly guiding direction and limiting options. Without spiritual discernment, these influences are often misidentified as personality flaws or fate. One of the reasons spiritual conflicts are often misunderstood is because they mimic natural problems. A spiritual attack can feel like exhaustion. Spiritual resistance can look like procrastination. Spiritual oppression can manifest as heaviness, anxiety, or loss of motivation. Because the symptoms are familiar, that the response is usually purely natural: more rest, more planning, more effort, more information. While these are valuable, they may not address the underlying conflict. When the root remains untouched, the cycle continues and frustration grows. Another key aspect of spiritual conflict is that it often targets potential rather than current performance. Many individuals experience their greatest struggles not when they are failing, but when they are progressing. As alignment increases, sensitivity increases, and the invisible realm responds. This is why some seasons of growth feel more contested than seasons of stagnation. The conflict is not about what is visible now, but about what is possible next. Spiritual opposition aims to interrupt momentum before it becomes irreversible. Spiritual battles are also collective, not just personal. A person may find themselves contending with pressures that did not originate from their own choices, but from the environment they are connected to. Families, cultures, institutions, and territories can all carry spiritual climates that influence those within them. This does not remove personal responsibility, but it explains why individual effort sometimes feels insufficient. A person can be doing many things right and still feel pushed backward by forces larger than themselves. Recognizing the spiritual dimension of conflict does not lead to fear, it leads to clarity. Fear thrives in ignorance, but understanding brings focus. When a person understands that a battle is spiritual, they stop wasting energy fighting symptoms and begin addressing causes. This shift changes the quality of prayer, decision making, and discipline. Prayer becomes intentional rather than emotional. Choices become strategic rather than reactive. Life is no longer lived in constant confusion about why things happen, but with awareness of how influence operates. The most important truth about spiritual conflict is that it is governed by order and authority, not chaos. The unseen realm responds to alignment, truth, and legitimacy. When a person aligns their life with light, integrity, and spiritual order, unseen resistance begins to weaken. Victory in spiritual conflict is not achieved by force of will, but by correct positioning. When positioning changes, outcomes follow. Because the invisible always shapes the visible long before the visible becomes apparent. Persistent patterns of resistance, loss, or limitation are often indicators that an active negative spiritual influence is at work. Life naturally contains challenges, delays, and seasons of struggle, but there is a difference between temporary difficulty and a repeating cycle that seems immune to effort, wisdom, and prayer. When a person consistently encounters the same obstacles in different forms, despite growth, learning, and sincere attempts to change, it suggests that the issue may not be situational, but systemic. Systems are designed to reproduce results, and in the spiritual realm, negative systems exist to maintain limitation. One of the clearest signs of such influence is resistance that appears disproportionate to the situation. Simple tasks become complicated, small steps require excessive effort, and progress feels heavily taxed. The energy invested does not reflect the outcome received. This imbalance creates frustration and fatigue, not because the person is incapable, but because something is actively opposing momentum. Over time, this kind of resistance can reshape self-perception, causing capable individuals to doubt their competence or worth, when in reality the opposition is external and strategic. Loss that repeats itself in similar patterns is another strong indicator. It may not always be dramatic or sudden. Often it is subtle and gradual. Opportunities slip away at the last moment. Relationships that begin with promise end the same way repeatedly. Financial stability is gained but never sustained. Each experience seems isolated, but when viewed together, a pattern emerges. The repetition is the key signal. Random loss teaches lessons, but patterned loss enforces limitation. Its purpose is not only to take something away, but to condition expectation, training the mind to anticipate disappointment. Limitation enforced by spiritual influence often masquerades as realism. A person may begin to believe that certain outcomes are simply not meant for them. They lower expectations, adjust dreams, and redefine success to match repeated disappointments. That this internal adjustment is one of the most dangerous effects of persistent limitation, because once a person agrees internally with the boundary being imposed, the external pressure no longer needs to be strong. The battle shifts from resistance to maintenance. At this stage, the influence has succeeded not only in limiting outcomes, but in shaping identity. Another aspect of pattern resistance is timing disruption. Progress may come, but never at the right time. Answers arrive late. Help appears after damage has been done. Breakthroughs come when they can no longer be fully enjoyed or utilized. This creates a sense of always being behind, always catching up, always starting over. Timing is a spiritual resource, and when it is consistently attacked, life becomes reactive rather than intentional. This kind of disruption is rarely accidental because it targets impact rather than activity. Persistent limitation also affects decision making. When resistance becomes familiar, people unconsciously begin to make safer, smaller choices. They avoid risk not because they lack courage, but because history has trained them to expect loss. This self-protective behavior looks wise on the surface, but it often reinforces the very limitation being imposed. The influence no longer needs to block progress. The person does it themselves by staying within invisible boundaries. What began as external opposition becomes internalized restriction. It is important to note that these patterns are not broken by effort alone. Hard work is valuable, but it cannot override a system designed to resist advancement. This is why some of the most disciplined, talented, and sincere individuals still experience stagnation. The issue is not a lack of capacity, but the presence of an opposing structure. until that structure is identified and confronted at its level of operation. Results remain inconsistent. Awareness is the first disruption of any negative pattern. When a person begins to observe repetition without self-blame, clarity replaces confusion. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with me?" the question becomes, "What is enforcing this outcome?" This shift restores dignity and focus. Patterns lose power when they are named and understood, because they thrive in confusion and misinterpretation. Once clarity enters, the individual is positioned to respond with spiritual intelligence rather than emotional reaction, and the cycle that once felt permanent begins to show signs of weakness and instability. Dreams, spiritual sensitivity, and repeated inner warnings often reveal the activity of hostile altars, because the human spirit is designed to perceive what the natural senses cannot. Long before a conflict becomes visible in daily life, it usually announces itself in subtle spiritual ways. When the mind is quiet and the defenses of rational control are lowered, such as during sleep, the spirit becomes more receptive to spiritual communication. This is why dreams have historically been a channel through which insight, warning, and revelation are received. They are not random images, but symbolic messages that reflect ongoing spiritual conversations. When hostile spiritual influence is active, dreams often take on a repetitive or emotionally intense nature. A single troubling dream may not mean much, but when similar themes appear repeatedly, it signals persistence in the spirit realm. Common patterns include running without a strap, being delayed or restrained, losing important items, falling from heights, being chased, or seeing familiar faces associated with fear or conflict. These symbols point to opposition, interference, and resistance. The repetition is important because it indicates that the influence is not momentary but sustained. The spirit is perceiving an ongoing pressure and translating it into symbolic language the mind can receive. Spiritual sensitivity also increases when there is active opposition. A person may notice heightened awareness, sudden inner discomfort in certain situations, or a strong sense of caution without logical explanation. This sensitivity is not anxiety, it is perception. The spirit often recognizes danger or conflict before the mind can articulate it. When these impressions are consistently ignored, the influence grows stronger because the warning system has been bypassed. Hostile altars rely on silence and disregard. They lose leverage when perception is honored and responded to wisely. Inner warnings often come as repeated impressions rather than dramatic experiences. A person may feel strongly discouraged from making certain choices or entering specific environments, yet feel drawn or pressured to do so anyway. When these warnings are ignored repeatedly, consequences tend to follow in predictable ways. Over time, the person may notice that the inner caution was accurate, but because it was subtle, it was dismissed. This pattern reveals that something is actively trying to influence direction, or either to push a person into harm or to blind them to danger. Another indicator of hostile activity is spiritual disturbance during prayer or quiet reflection. Instead of peace, the person may experience sudden distraction, heaviness, or confusion. Thoughts may scatter, focus may weaken, and emotional resistance may rise without a clear cause. This is not always a lack of discipline. When such disruption is consistent and targeted, it often points to spiritual contention. The aim is to interrupt clarity, because clarity leads to authority. If understanding is blocked, effective response is delayed. Dreams and inner impressions can also expose patterns that have been normalized in daily life. In waking hours, people often rationalize unhealthy environments, relationships, or habits. In dreams, these same elements may appear as threats, traps, or obstacles. The spirit reveals truth without social filters or self-justification. When the same symbols appear again and again, they are inviting attention, not fear. They are revealing what the conscious mind has learned to tolerate, but the spirit still recognizes as dangerous. It is important to approach these experiences with discernment rather than obsession. Not every dream is a prophecy, and not every impression is a warning. However, consistency and alignment with life patterns provide clarity. When spiritual impressions align with repeated life outcomes, they form a message that should not be ignored. Hostile altars thrive when their activity remains unrecognized. Recognition weakens them because it invites intentional response. When a person begins to pay attention to these spiritual signals without panic, they regain agency. Awareness restores choice. Instead of being led unconsciously by unseen pressure, the individual becomes responsive rather than reactive. Dreams, sensitivity, and inner warnings are not meant to control behavior, but to inform it. They are early indicators, allowing intervention before damage becomes visible. When these signals are honored, the power of hostile influence begins to diminish because its greatest advantage, secrecy, has been removed and replaced with clarity and alertness. Prayer, revelation, and alignment with God's light are the primary ways spiritual attacks are exposed and defeated, because the spirit realm responds to authority, not effort. Many people pray from a place of desperation without understanding that effective prayer is not emotional expression alone, but legal engagement. Prayer is the language of authority when it is built on truth and understanding. When a person prays without revelation, they may be sincere, but their prayers lack precision. Revelation provides context, and context determines accuracy. Without knowing what is happening spiritually, prayers can become repetitive requests rather than targeted enforcement of higher authority. Revelation is the unveiling of what is hidden. Spiritual attacks thrive in secrecy because ignorance delays response. When light enters, confusion begins to dissolve. Revelation does not always come dramatically. Often it comes as understanding, clarity, or a sudden recognition of patterns that were previously dismissed. This awareness shifts prayer from vague petitions to intentional declarations. Instead of asking why things keep happening, the individual begins to address what is enforcing those outcomes. Revelation turns prayer into a strategic act rather than a reaction to pain. Alignment with God's light is essential because authority in the spirit realm flows from position, not volume. Light represents truth, righteousness, and order. When a person's life is misaligned, even powerful prayers can lose effectiveness because authority is compromised. Alignment is not about perfection, but about agreement. Agreement with truth gives legitimacy. When a person aligns their choices, values, and direction with light, that they step into a position where their voice carries weight. Darkness does not retreat because of noise. It retreats because it has no legal ground to remain. Prayer exposes spiritual attacks by confronting them with truth. Many spiritual conflicts persist because they are misdiagnosed. A person may pray for relief when what is needed is confrontation, or pray for strength when what is required is correction. Revelation brings diagnosis, and prayer enforces the cure. When prayer is combined with understanding, it becomes a tool of exposure. Hidden influences lose power when named and addressed. The spirit realm operates on recognition. What is recognized can be resisted. What is ignored continues unchallenged. Alignment also protects against unnecessary battles. Many attacks gain access through inconsistency, compromise, or unguarded decisions. When a person walks in alignment, access points begin to close. This does not mean challenges disappear, but it means attacks lose legitimacy. The difference between oppression and opposition is legality. Opposition may still occur even when aligned, but oppression loses its right to stay. Alignment does not remove resistance, it changes its outcome. Prayer is also how authority is sustained over time. Spiritual victories are rarely instant and permanent without maintenance. Altars and systems that have existed for years do not always collapse in a moment. Consistent prayer maintains pressure. It reinforces truth repeatedly until resistance weakens. This consistency is not striving, that it is persistence rooted in confidence. A person who understands alignment does not pray anxiously, they pray firmly. Their prayers are not attempts to convince God, but declarations that reflect agreement with His will. Revelation deepens discernment. As understanding increases, sensitivity sharpens. A person becomes quicker to recognize subtle shifts, distractions, or pressures. This awareness prevents escalation. Many spiritual attacks succeed because they are allowed to grow unnoticed. Early discernment leads to early response. And early response limits damage. Revelation is therefore not just about information, but about timing. Alignment with light also restores peace, which is a spiritual weapon often underestimated. Peace stabilizes focus. A disturbed mind struggles to exercise authority. When peace is restored through alignment, clarity follows. From clarity comes decisive prayer. Spiritual attacks aim to create chaos because chaos weakens coordination. Alignment reintroduces order, and order strengthens authority. Ultimately, prayer, revelation, and alignment work together as a system. Prayer without revelation lacks direction. Revelation without alignment lacks authority. Alignment without prayer lacks enforcement. When all three operate together, spiritual attacks are not only resisted, but exposed, weakened, and displaced. Light does not negotiate with darkness. It replaces it through legitimacy and presence. And when light is sustained, darkness finds no space to operate, no voice to speak, and no structure to remain. Victory over demonic altars requires consistency, spiritual authority, and a life rooted in righteousness and truth, because the spirit realm responds to order, continuity, and legitimacy. Spiritual opposition is rarely defeated by momentary intensity. Many people experience brief moments of breakthrough only to find old patterns returning, not because the victory was false, but because it was not sustained. Altars are built over time, strengthened by repetition, agreement, and reinforcement. In the same way, overcoming them requires sustained spiritual pressure rather than occasional reaction. Consistency is essential because spiritual systems do not operate on emotion, they operate on continuity. When prayer, obedience, and alignment are inconsistent, pressure weakens and opposing systems regain confidence. Consistency does not mean praying all the time, but living all the time with awareness and intentionality. A consistent spiritual life maintains an atmosphere where negative influences cannot easily re-establish themselves. Many defeats happen not during intense battles, but during quiet periods when vigilance fades. Spiritual authority is preserved through consistency, not enthusiasm. Spiritual authority is not a title or position. It is the result of alignment with truth and submission to higher order. Authority flows from legitimacy. In the spirit realm, voices are weighed, not heard equally. A person who lives contrary to truth may pray loudly but speak softly in the spirit. Authority increases when words, actions, and values agree. This is why righteousness is not a religious demand, but a strategic advantage. Righteousness removes internal contradiction. When there is no contradiction, authority is undivided. Demonic altars exploit inconsistency and compromise because these create openings. When a person declares freedom but lives in habitual disobedience, the declaration loses weight. This does not mean perfection is required, but sincerity and direction are. The spirit realm recognizes trajectory. A life genuinely moving toward truth gains authority even while still in process. What weakens authority most is not failure, but agreement with failure. Come, when a person justifies what they know is misaligned, they grant legitimacy to opposition. Truth is central to sustained victory because deception is the foundation of spiritual bondage. Many altars survive not because they are powerful, but because they are believed. Beliefs shape agreement. Come, and agreement empowers influence. When truth replaces false beliefs, the altar loses its audience. This is why transformation of the mind is a spiritual weapon. A person who no longer believes the lie no longer feeds the system built on that lie. Truth starves altars of relevance. Consistency also applies to decisions and boundaries. Spiritual authority is reinforced by what a person repeatedly allows or refuses. Boundaries are spiritual statements. When a person consistently refuses environments, relationships, or habits that weaken alignment, they strengthen their authority without saying a word. Authority is as much about what is avoided as what is confronted. Over time, these choices create a spiritual reputation. The unseen realm recognizes patterns of discipline and restraint. Righteousness creates stability. Stability limits volatility. Altars thrive in chaos, confusion, and emotional extremes. A stable life grounded in truth becomes difficult to manipulate. Emotional regulation, integrity, and humility are not just character traits, they are defensive structures. When emotions are controlled, reactions are delayed. When reactions are delayed, discernment has space to operate. This reduces unnecessary battles and conserves strength for real ones. Victory over demonic altars is often progressive rather than instant. Each consistent act of obedience weakens the opposing system. Each truthful decision reinforces authority. Over time, the altar loses influence not through dramatic collapse but through gradual irrelevance. Its voice becomes quieter. Its effects become weaker. Its presence becomes easier to resist. The ultimate goal is not constant confrontation, but lasting freedom. Lasting freedom is maintained by a life that no longer supports the systems it once suffered under. When righteousness and truth become the foundation of daily living, spiritual authority stabilizes naturally. In such a life, victory is not something pursued repeatedly. It becomes the default state. Because the conditions that once sustained opposition no longer exist. And without those conditions, demonic altars have nothing left to stand on or draw strength from. Spiritual battles are real, but they are not meant to leave believers confused, afraid, or powerless. The presence of resistance, repeated loss, inner warnings, or unseen pressure does not mean defeat. It means there is a deeper dimension to be understood and addressed. When life is viewed only through natural explanations, Spiritual systems remain unchallenged and continue to shape outcomes silently. But when awareness comes, authority follows. Understanding how spiritual altars operate reveals that nothing persists without permission, and nothing holds power once higher truth is enforced. The journey toward freedom begins with discernment and is sustained by alignment. Prayer becomes effective when it is rooted in revelation, and revelation becomes powerful when it produces obedience and truth-based living. Consistency, righteousness, and clarity are not optional spiritual ideals. They are the foundations of lasting victory. When a life no longer feeds darkness through ignorance, compromise, or misalignment, opposing systems weaken and lose relevance. Victory is not achieved through fear or obsession with opposition, but through establishment in light. A higher spiritual position always overrides a lower one, not through struggle, but through legitimacy. When truth governs thoughts, choices, and direction, spiritual authority stabilizes naturally. In such a state, attacks are recognized early, patterns are broken intentionally, and freedom becomes sustainable rather than temporary. The goal is not merely to fight battles, but to live in a way that removes the conditions that allow those battles to continue.